Let's go ahead and walk through that coherentist argument, what I call the doxastic assent argument. So recall that coherentism is that second approach to doing epistemology, where you prioritize how do we know. Once you've answered that question, then you turn your attention to what do we know. Sosa thinks this is what generates coherentist theories. And the metaphor that he uses to talk about coherentist theories, the idea of a raft, that goes back to Otto Neurath, an early logical positivist in Vienna. It's at this point that Sosa introduces this argument, the common argument for coherence theories, which he notes is largely a negative argument. It's largely an argument that, hey, foundationalism doesn't work. We're the only other game in town, hence we must be the good theory. It's basically a similar strategy that we find employed in the regress argument that we'll look at in just a bit. So I call this argument the doxastic assent argument. The idea here is before you can ascend up from your basic foundational beliefs, you have to have basic foundational beliefs that are capable of moving that justification up. So the beliefs have to be able to be justified that are higher up in my knowledge edifice. This is a pretty complicated argument in that it's got different lines of reasoning being unified together. I couldn't get it all onto one slide, so make sure that you follow along with this. If you have troubles, watch it again. Make sure that you follow what's going on here. So there's this main line of argumentation. I label that CA, CA1, CA2, CA3, our conclusion CA4. Then there's an argument line for one horn of the dilemma and an argument line for the other horn of the dilemma. Here's our dilemma. Either the mental states that serve as terminal nodes in epistemic regresses are propositional attitudes or they're not. So just to simplify things, either they're beliefs, propositional attitudes, or they're not. Let's take one horn of that dilemma. Suppose they are propositional attitudes. Suppose they are beliefs. Let's see how that plays out. Propositional attitudes don't give one direct contact with reality. I have beliefs, they can be true, but nothing about believing guarantees they'll be true. Hence, I need something like a theory of justification whenever I've got these propositional attitudes. Whenever I've got beliefs, I need to make sure that they are accurate descriptions of the world. Premise 2. If a state doesn't give one direct contact with reality, then it provides no guarantee against error. That's what my theory of justification is supposed to help me with. If a state provides one with no guarantee against error, then it cannot serve as a foundation for knowledge. Therefore, punchline, this horn of the dilemma, propositional attitudes can't serve as a foundation for knowledge. So the two possibilities, first possibility, propositional attitudes, not going to work out. Now let's look at the other horn of the dilemma. Let's suppose that they're not propositional attitudes. Let's suppose that they're not beliefs. How does that play out? Well, if it's not a propositional attitude, then it can provide no logical support for our hypothesis. Remember, the idea behind the intellectualist model is that a belief can justify another belief because if it's justified and I make an inference that's driven by the content of those beliefs, today is Tuesday, I infer it's the second day of the week. If my belief that it's Tuesday is in fact justified, I make that inference where the content guarantees the truth of my conclusion, then the justification gets transferred along with the truth in this parasitic fashion. Now, if it's not a propositional attitude, there is no content, there is no parasitic transference of justification through inference. If a state can't supply logical support for a hypothesis, then it can't serve as a foundation for knowledge. Hence, if a mental state is not a propositional attitude, so if it's not a belief, then it cannot serve as a foundation for knowledge. Other horn of the dilemma. Now I tie them together again. C4, the conclusion of my argument. Therefore, given the result from the first horn, A4, propositional attitudes, not going to work for you, foundationalist, and my conclusion from the second horn of the dilemma, B3, not propositional attitudes, not going to work for you, foundationalist. No mental state can serve as a foundation for knowledge. No foundational beliefs, no basic beliefs, no end of an epistemic regress. Foundationalism is bad. Coherentism is the only other game in town. Hence, I must be good. So we should really recognize the outline of this argument from the Bonjour article. And in fact, we should recognize the outline of Sosa's response to it from my response to the Bonjour article. Sosa looks at this argument and he says, look, I have a problem with this second horn of the dilemma, this idea that gets expressed with B1. If it's not a propositional attitude, i.e. not a belief, then it can provide no logical support for a hypothesis. Sosa says, that seems false to me. As I see it, really, there are two problems with this second horn of the dilemma. The first problem is just the falseness of B1, he thinks. He says, consider consequentialist ethics. It seems to provide us with an excellent example of legitimate extra-attitudinal justification for propositions. That is, I can justify propositions without appealing to more propositional attitudes. How would that work? Well, our good friend Mill here would give us a nice example. Mill might say, look, my belief that laissez-faire societies are good is justified, not because of other beliefs I have, but because of the real-world consequences of such societies. What makes an action good is the actual result, the greatest good for the greatest number. If that happens as a result of my action, that justifies my belief about what I should have done. That justifies my belief that that action was in fact good. Nothing about my believing it needs to be introduced into this equation. It's just the world justifying my belief. So that's side one. Or not. Now, if you're confused or you're struggling to get a hold of this idea about B1, that first objection to B1, then focus on that. Go back and look at the lecture up to that point. Ignore what I'm about to say. If you feel comfortable enough that you think you can handle it, go ahead and listen on. Here's the difficulty. Mill isn't thinking about whether or not his belief about laissez-faire societies is justified because of their consequences. Mill is just making a claim about the ethical status of laissez-faire societies. They are, in fact, good, regardless of whether or not I believe it, regardless of whether or not I'm justified in believing it. That's kind of the point of consequentialism. Laissez-faire societies are good because of their net impact on the overall happiness of the people that society encompasses. The justification, I think Mill would say, for his belief that laissez-faire societies are good is spelled out in his theory. He's got beliefs. Those beliefs are premises from which he makes the argument laissez-faire societies are good. So I don't think that you quite get justification of beliefs about laissez-faire societies out of this. But you do get normative properties can be seen to supervene upon the world without them having anything to do with the beliefs of the individual people that are affected by those actions, those societal structures. Laissez-faire societies are good. They're not good because of what you believe. They are good because if you're in a laissez-faire society, then boom, greater happiness than you would have if you weren't in a laissez-faire society. That, by the way, is all false, but forget about that. I think you get normative evaluations based upon facts about the world. But I don't think from consequentialist ethics you get anything like your beliefs about those normative evaluations somehow get justified without any attitudinal intervention. So I don't think it really quite works when we frame it in terms of justification in the way that Sosa has. However, if we frame it in terms of, is it possible for us to understand how normative or evaluative terms can get applied, not because of the beliefs that I have, but because of the facts about the world, the facts about how these things operate, then I think that looks fine. We'll pick this up, the second half of the objection, in the next lecture module.